Hello, here I am again giving you guys another discussion to an empty classroom. This is with the chapter 19 notes that go with Charles Darwin, the first part of that particular chapter. Starting out here with this presentation picture here, just to remind you about Evo Devo. These two dogs are the same breed, they're Whippets. This is what's called a Hulk Whippet, and this is just what most Whippets tend to look like. The difference between these two dogs is one gene that is involved with muscle, like shutting down muscle enhancement, I guess, is broken in this dog, is mutated and doesn't work in this dog. So just an idea that it doesn't take much. Keep in mind that it does not take much to end up with pretty big changes in phenotypes of organisms. Okay. So, chapter 19, we're looking at evolution by means of natural selection. Keep in mind those two terms, evolution and natural selection, are not equal. They don't mean one, evolution does not mean natural selection. Natural selection is a way, it's a means by, it's a way that evolution can end up happening. There's other ways too, as we'll learn about in the next chapter. Okay, so we have to think about Charles Darwin and think about the time that he was going on the voyage with the Beagle. It was the 1930s, and we got to think about what was known in science, what was he working with at the time. So, geology. So if we're looking at geology, and he was definitely a scholar, read lots of books, very interested in geology particularly, and predominant thinking at the time was that the Earth was very old, but slow change could result in profound geologic changes over time. Darwin brought a book along with him on the voyage that had just been published by Lyell, which he was a proponent for this very, very long expanse of time that the Earth was around, which was kind of a newer idea compared to what had been previously thought. What was known about classification, so how living organisms are grouped, and how that's Linnaeus stuff. Okay, so classification was a very old field. It's just I think it's innate in people is to want to organize things. Definitely Linnaeus would have been a person that, if he ate his M&Ms, would have eaten them in color order for sure. He definitely liked to organize things. He's the founder of taxonomy, which is the field of classifying organisms based upon similarities, and binomial nomenclature, so that's the two-word naming system that we use for species. So things like Homo sapiens, that's binomial nomenclature, and that's Linnaeus came up with that system. All right, so what Linnaeus did when he was figuring out this system was he clustered organisms into categories, but wasn't really assuming evolutionary relatedness. He was just organizing them for the sake of organizing them. Okay, paleontology. Paleontology is the study of fossils. It was developed by Cuvier. It was a kind of a newer field. We're looking in the 1830s, and this was developed in the early 1800s more. He did notice that species would appear in the fossil record and then disappear in the fossil record. So that gave an idea that the Earth is not unchanging, that species composition is something that changes as time goes on, and that there are current species that were not around in the past. Okay, and that's contrary to what some of the previous thinking had been. Particularly some of the religious thinking, so we have to think about that as far as the age of the Earth and about what the composition of species out there. Most religions were predominantly that these species had been around forever, since the beginning of time, since the Garden of Eden things. All right, so heredity. What did we know about genetics and heredity? All right, so Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin lived at the same time. They were contemporaries. They didn't know each other. They lived in different countries. And remember, Mendel's ideas were not really accepted, rediscovered until the 1900s, until say right around 1900. So although Mendel was discovering how heredity works at the same time as Charles Darwin was puzzling through natural selection, they did not, although they would have helped each other quite a bit, especially if Darwin knew about Mendel's work, that would have helped him tremendously, we'll get to coming up. All right, molecular genetics, what do we know about DNA? This is 100 years before Griffiths discovering this transforming factor. This is definitely, it wasn't until the 1950s that we knew about the double helix. Certainly didn't know DNA was the genetic material at this time. Okay, here's a timeline just kind of showing where some of these scientists, what their lifespan was, and just kind of give you an idea here. So here's Charles Darwin, here's Gregor Mendel. Notice this is kind of overlapping with, here's the US Civil War, so that's about where we are in time. Okay, so evolution was not something that was discovered by Charles Darwin. There were theories of evolution that dated back quite a bit earlier than this. But the mechanism for how populations change over time, that's where Darwin came in and actually proposed a means that this could happen that made some sense. But there were theories of biological evolution and how this happened much earlier. The predominant thinking at the time was Lamarckian, and I kind of laugh about Lamarck right now, but got to give Lamarck a little bit of a break. He was the first to propose a mechanism for evolution, change in a population over time, that related to the environment. Biological changes then would happen because the environment was changing, and he's right about that. So that's great. Good job, Lamarck, with that. However, his means by which populations changed, really not true. Really, really problematic. So his ideas of use and disuse, big problems with them. The idea with use and disuse means that if you have a body structure that you're utilizing, that you're using routinely, that's going to cause that body structure to get larger and bigger and stronger. Or if you are constantly, the idea with if you look up Lamarck and look up images, you're going to get giraffes, because his idea is that as giraffes are stretching their necks to reach leaves that are higher in the tree, their necks get longer in their lifetime. Okay, that's kind of the idea with Lamarck. That if you use a structure, it is going to get bigger, stronger, longer, taller, things like that. Disuse, anything you don't use, will dwindle. And then you compound that with inheritance of these acquired characteristics during your lifetime. So not only would a giraffe be able to stretch its neck within its lifetime, then it would pass on that longer neck to its offspring, who then would stretch its neck in its lifetime, and then would pass that on into the next generation, and so on. So with each generation of giraffes, the necks would get longer because of these two mechanisms. That is clearly not the way this works. If we had an inheritance of acquired characteristics, we would have things like, hey, you study biology right now, so that means that your children are going to be born already knowing inherently more biology than if you didn't. That's the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay, so that's just so not right? That idea is, be careful of the way that you phrase things when you're looking at natural selection, and organisms can't pick up characteristics because they need to, because they want to, because it's necessary. That's Lamarckian ideas, and that is not the way genetics works, right? Okay, so Charles Darwin, when he was in his very early 20s, he set sail in the Beagle. This was a 5-year voyage. The purpose of the voyage was to do mapping and charting off of particularly the coast of South America, but they went all around the world. And I can't even imagine what his quarters must have been like. He was brought along as the ship's naturalist and also as a companion to the captain, because Charles Darwin was a high society kind of guy. And so the captain would often bring along somebody who they could socialize with, because the crew and the captain were different social castes, and they were not supposed to typically be hanging around together. And this is a 5-year voyage. So the captain would take along a buddy. That's Charles Darwin. But Charles Darwin would be he would be dropped off places, be left there for a couple of weeks, and he was, while he was there, he was acting as a naturalist. And he was collecting organisms, collecting specimens, bringing them back onto the ship, describing them. He took 3,000 pages of notes while he was on this voyage. And I can't even imagine what his quarters must have been like with, ship's quarters are small, and he was carrying back with him all of these dead things. It must have been crazy. But one of the things he did notice is that these organisms that were off the coast of South America, and that would include the Galapagos Islands, which are off, and you'll see that maps coming up here. It's off the western coast of northern South America. They looked more like South American species, the birds and the plants and things like that that he was noticing in these islands off of South America. They looked like South American continental species more than they looked like island species that were far away on the globe. So he was kind of noticing a relatedness, kind of a particular characteristics that were characteristic of that particular area in the world. So, and he was thinking then about, okay, now these are very unique organisms though. They're not the same as the ones in South America. They are different. So he's thinking about how this Lyell, who was this geologist that looked at life over he was looking at geology over vast periods of time, and how you could get these really big changes to the geologic structures if you do it a little tiny bit at a time. Like erosion can build up and you can end up with gorges and things like that. So Darwin's thinking about, could this work with living things? If we have this starting population of organisms, and if we give them enough time, will they change in response to various different environments that they live in? And could that then lead to a diversity of different species, a wide diversity of different species that ultimately Darwin was getting down to started with a single common ancestor? Okay, so this is where the Beagle sailed as a British ship. Charles Darwin was British. Set sail for South America, went around. Here's the Galapagos Islands, right on the equator, off the coast of Lake Ecuador. Then went around, stopped in Australia a couple places, went back over to South America, and then back up to Great Britain, 5 years. Some of the specimens that Charles Darwin was collecting, some of the birds. Of course, he's the most famous. These are called Darwin's finches today. Kind of brought them back with him and puzzled over them, looked at them, got a little bit of help from another friend about the differences between some of the different species. And noticed differences in their beaks, particularly, that were related potentially to the food sources that were on the various different islands that he was looking at. So you take a look that these are all species of finches that live in the Galapagos Islands. But because of their various different food sources on different islands, like this definitely is living in a tree. There's some of the Galapagos Islands don't even have any trees on them. So the food sources here are going to be really different than the food sources there on that island. It's a seed eater that's eating some seeds off of either grass or off of bushes and things like that. All right, so evolution is change in the gene pool of a population over generations in response to environmental change. So as environmental change takes place, certain organisms are going to survive and reproduce, and others are not going to have what it takes, and they're not going to have as many babies. Maybe they die, and that's why they don't have any babies. So then your next generation ends up having characteristics and genes in their predominance. The frequency of particular genes will change over time. So even if it's just frequency of a dominant allele or a recessive allele changing from one generation to the next, that is evolution. So we're looking at small scale evolution here, which is called microevolution. All right, so that's microevolution, but you can compound it together and look at all of the accumulated changes that have taken place over time. That's macroevolution, so you can build up to this, and that's kind of how we're going to be looking at this unit. We're starting small with the microevolution, just changes in gene pools, and we will get to eventually speciation, groups of organisms, a little bit with classification and things like that. Okay, so Darwin, he did not really say evolution in the publication that he produced because it had such a negative connotation at the time. He called this that the population would change, would descend with modification. So descent with modification. All right, let me skip that. Okay, so one of the things that Darwin did after he got back was he's trying to classify different organisms. And Linnaeus had already developed a classification scheme that, like I said, Linnaeus didn't imply that evolutionary relatedness, but he'd already kind of done some of the work for Darwin, who was trying to apply evolutionary relatedness. Okay, is there a reason why these organisms are all grouped together and have some of the same characteristics? Maybe it's because they're more closely related evolutionarily. So Darwin is working with what Linnaeus already had. Okay, so here's where you now need to know the levels of classification. These are Linnaeus's levels of classification: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and the most specific will be species. We'll talk about speciation coming up in a chapter or two. There's mnemonics for this. Maybe you learned kings play chess on Fridays, generally speaking, or King Philip came over from Greater Spain. Or maybe you had me for biology and you learned the PG-13-ish version of this. And I did not make this up, I didn't make it up, but was kinky people can often find great sex. I learned that in college. If it helps you to remember the orders of classification, whatever. Okay. All right, so let's get into the mechanism of natural selection. How does this work? And I really like the way that the textbook breaks this down into these observations. These are things that we can just observe in nature, and then inferences based upon those observations. All right, so observation number 1. Members of a population vary in their characteristics. Okay, so there's variation within a population, and a lot of this variation is genetic. I don't think that link will work without my keyboard, so hang on. Some pictures. Okay, so members of a population vary in characteristics. All right, so here we have a picture of a population, ladybugs. There's definitely some differences between them. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger, some of them are more yellow in color, some of them are brighter red in color. They would also have differences potentially in their, like how fast they are. They might have differences in some of their behavior components as well. You know, this guy's mean, whatever. So they can have a lot of these variations within the population that are genetic, things that can be passed on from one generation to the next via genes. Okay. Observation number 2. Overreproduction happens in nature. Many of the babies that are born are not going to make it till adulthood. Many offspring fail to reproduce. A lot of offspring are eaten, for example, as eggs even potentially, but you know, as youngsters and things like that before they reach reproductive age. Think about fish eggs. You know, like a single fish when it spawns will lay hundreds of eggs. That's one fish producing hundreds of eggs, even just one spawning year. And you consider all of the female fish in the lake all laying hundreds of eggs. If all of those survive till adulthood, that'd be crazy. There'd be so many, it wouldn't work. So definitely there's overreproduction. There's not enough food for all of those individuals. And then also there are predators, there's disease, there's whole bunches of things that can end up causing some of the individuals to die. And that does happen. Overreproduction happens in nature. Many offspring fail to reproduce, fail to live long enough to reproduce. Okay, so we can draw an inference or a conclusion based upon those first 2 facts. All right, so inference number 1, struggle for survival is going to ensue. We only have so many resources, only some are going to survive, and then there's variation. So the organisms that have the best variations, the strongest variations, the variations that are good adaptations for survival, those are going to be the ones that make it. Okay, next. Another inference. This unequal survival of these organisms with these various different variations is going to lead to only those that have the favorable variations having babies, because the ones that didn't have the favorable variations, they died. Dead things don't have babies. I say that over and over again in this chapter. Dead things don't have babies. So only the ones that are alive and made it and are healthy are going to end up having babies. That's going to end up leading to the next generation having more of those favorable characteristics for that particular environment that we're dealing with. So those with favorable variations, they tend to accumulate in the population over time, over generations we're talking about here. Okay. So that's how natural selection works. Key concepts. Okay, in order to have natural selection, you must have variation in the population. Without variation, if everybody's a clone, you can't have natural selection operating because nobody is better suited for the environment. There's no difference in fitness. The smallest unit or group of organisms that can evolve is a population. A single individual cannot evolve. You cannot evolve. You cannot adapt. Those are some of the terms that you might use maybe just in your general speaking, but it isn't biological to say that. It's not correct in the science classroom to say that an individual evolved. Unlike Pokemon, you can't evolve, okay? So, populations can though. A change in a group of organisms over generations. Those are a couple of really, really, really important misconceptions that sometimes people have. So, genetic variations arise in nature, it's mutation. And then changes in expression of existing genes also can affect it. So things like Evo-Devo that we talked about, that can also cause changes in a population over time. Mutation, changes in expression of existing genes. Okay, let's do some examples. All right, so do I have this? So Peter and Rosemary Grant are professors at Princeton University. They're married. They have been going to the island of Daphne Major, which is on the Galapagos Islands, since the 1970s. And every year they go there and spend the summer there, and they basically do a whole inventory of all of the ground finches that live there. They collect them all and they mass them. They put a tag on them, and the most important thing that they're looking at is the frequency of their beak sizes. So they measure the beaks on them as well. Besides that, they also take note of the plant populations that are there. Oh no. Okay. I'll have to. That's just a slide in this presentation. They also take note of the food sources that are there and can relate them. So this is the picture it's supposed to connect to. Okay, so see, they're measuring the beak depth. They've been doing this since the 1970s. It goes past this. This is just a snapshot, but they're still going there as far as I know. What they find is that in dry years, there's not much grass seed. Okay, so this is an island that really only has a couple of different food sources for these birds. There's grass, and then there's these bushes that make nuts. Dry years, the grass goes dormant and it doesn't produce seeds. So there's not a lot of the small grass seed available. The only thing available are these nuts to eat that these birds can eat if their beak is big enough to handle it. So the large beaked birds are the only ones that can survive during a dry year. Small beaked birds, they pretty much die. There was one year where they were talking about a drought, and then they just had many, many dead birds. A high percentage of the population died that particular year, and the majority of them had small beaks. So then the next generation of babies, bigger beaks, because it's genetic, this beak differences. The converse happens in wet years when there's a lot of grass seeds. So during wet years when there's a lot of grass seeds, the small beaked birds do very well. And so you end up seeing that in the next generation, an overall smaller beak as time goes on. That's natural selection. All right, so we gotta go back to where we were here before. All right, let's see if any of these other links work. Antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Nope. All right. Leave that out there. So antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Do I even have a picture for that? Maybe not. Nope. Huh. All right, we'll just deal with this. Okay, so antibiotic resistance in bacteria would be that basically when you take an antibiotic, you're changing the environment that the bacteria that are inside of you are exposed to. Okay, so like say your strep throat that you've got, those bacteria. You're changing their environment, and only those individuals that can survive that particular chemical are going to be the ones that can reproduce. So there's going to be variation within the population as far as how resistant they are, how many of them are resistant, differences in that one's not resistant at all, that one is very resistant. The resistant ones then are going to be the ones that have babies, and so your next generation is going to be resistant bacteria. That's why it's very important when you're taking an antibiotic to make sure that you take the entire course and you follow the directions that the doctor gives you. Very similar to antibiotic resistant bacteria would be pesticide or herbicide resistance for for a farm. So let's say that you were growing soybeans and you sprayed pesticides on the field in order to kill some kinds of buggies that were eating your crops. Most of them are going to die, right? You put a chemical on them that's supposed to kill them. The majority of them are going to die. But there's going to be a few individuals that have a resistance to that particular chemical. They're going to survive. They're going to have babies, and so your next generation is going to have more individuals that are resistant. You're not going to be able to use the same chemical again the next year. One more example. This one is kind of a cute little example. These are soapberry bugs. Soapberry bugs, they look a lot like the box elder bugs around here. But soapberry bugs have this long beak that they use to stick into fruit. All right, so here it is. So you soapberry bug, and this is the fruit that they're typically eating. It's called balloon vine fruit. So, and this is in Florida. So the normal fruit, native fruit would be this balloon vine, and they have this very long beak, this really long straw-like thing that helps them to be able to get down to the juices that they're looking for. And so that's where we would have kind of historically. However, I forgot the years on this, but I think it was in the 1970s, the balloon vine population declined, and then there was also an increase in other populations that people planted or were invasive species. So it was another source of food for the soapberry bugs. So if we take a look on these introduced species, the average beak size doesn't need to be quite so big because the shape of the fruit is different. So the individuals that were best suited were not the ones with the really, really, really long beaks in this new environment because there's this new food source. So the ones that did the best were the ones with shorter beaks, and so you ended up seeing a shift in the sizes of the beaks on average as time went on because of the change in the environment with these soapberry bugs. All right.